Live. Thank you very much. Okay, reconvening. Do we have Daniel, the two Daniels on the phone? Are you there? Daniel Ingram, yes. Daniel Tayan? Okay. I can see Pamela's emailing him, so could you ask him just to announce himself when he comes back online? I understand that they may not be... Are you there? He is there. Okay, thank you. I understand they may not be able to see the screen, either of them. So both of Daniel Ingram and Daniel Tayan, please, when there's an appropriate pause, just feel free to jump in if you have something to say. Okay, so we're going to skip through the agenda, or change the agenda a little bit, and we're going to move to potential approval of GRI's... Oh, they're up. The numbers are up there, and these are the order in which we're going to do them: 416, 417, 205, 408, and 409. I think the change of order is because if we go into the time when Dwight can come online, the ones toward the end are the ones that he's more likely to have a comment on. But even if we do get there before he's online, we have his comments to date. Okay, so I'm passing over now to Chelsea. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So we'll start with GRI 416, Customer Health and Safety. And actually, we had the same comment raised by a GSSB member that relates to this standard and to 417, Marketing and Labeling. So we thought we will take them in turn at the beginning. So the concern we had raised was similar a little bit to the discussion we had around incident this morning, was about the definition of non-compliance with regulations. And this was brought into the guidance on the standards. So the current guidance wording we have is non-compliance with regulations refers to a court judgment on failure to act in accordance with regulations or laws. The concern raised by a GSSB member was that this could exclude the many or majority of instances of non-compliance that might be determined by a regulator, a tribunal, etc., and that therefore this definition might be too strict. This was inherited from G4, so I imagine it was produced by the G4 working group for customer health and safety, and it also affects marketing and labeling, which will be the next standard that we take in turn. So whatever agreement we make here, we should carry through as well. And Standards Division does not have a strong opinion on this point. We can see the value of adjusting it, but we are also slightly hesitant to revise the work of the G4 working groups. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael to elaborate on this point, as it was his point, or to get any other GSSB comments.
Okay, thanks, Chelsea. I think you've explained the reason I raised it. I'm also cognizant of not deviating from G4 if we don't need to. It just seemed to me that this was a very deficient definition of non-compliance, in that it excluded, a lot of regulatory action, etc. Having said that, I'm not a practitioner, and others who are practitioners may well understand better the why this sort of limiting type definition is there. So I would ask anyone on the board who has a comment on this, particularly if you have a contrary view, to raise it now, please. Both Daniels, feel free to jump in. Okay, we have no one willing to speak, so the default is that we would accept that this paragraph be removed, and I think we're agreeing to that. Chelsea, are there other things in this standard?
Not that were mentioned by GSSB members ahead of this meeting.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have anything else they would like to say about this standard, which is... 416. Thank you. 416, Customer Health and Safety. That being the case, I think we have consensus, no sustained objection to the issue of this standard. I just note, for the purpose of the recording, that Robin Edmey is not in the room at the moment. However, we do still have a quorum and enough people to vote this out. That being the case, Bastian, could I ask you whether due process has been met?
Due process has been met for the standard.
To date, Chelsea. Chelsea, can I ask you to run through the changes?
Sure. So we would be looking at approving, voting to approve the version of GRI 416, subject to implementing the agreed upon overarching changes in the introduction content as discussed this morning, including updating the numbering of the universal standards and the updated infographic, and also to remove the definition of noncompliance from the guidance section, currently in lines 165 and 166 of that draft.
Thank you. With that in mind, can I ask members of the GSSB in the room to raise their hand if they agree to issuing this standard?
So we have 10 votes for agreement in the room.
Thank you. Daniel Tayant, can I ask if you agree?
I do agree.
Thank you. Daniel Ingram?
I do.
Thank you. Bastian, were there any significant changes in your view between the exposure draft and the final approved GRI standard that require re-exposure?
No significant changes.
Okay, can I ask members in the room if they agree to issue this standard as a final without re-exposure to raise their hands?
We have 10 votes in agreement.
Thank you. Daniel Tayant, do you agree?
Yes, I agree.
Daniel Ingram, do you agree?
I do.
Thank you. That being the case, we've got 12, which is the number we need to approve it. So that standard is also approved. Excellent. Thank you. Chelsea.
All right, trucking along here. So the next standard on the list is GRI 417, marketing and labeling. We had the same issue raised. It applies here as well, related to the guidance around non-compliance with regulations. So we would suggest that based on the decisions just made, that we also delete these paragraphs. It occurs twice in guidance here. And we would then put this forward subject to removing these lines of guidance 158, 159, and 185, 186 in GRI 417.
Would anyone like to comment on this or any other aspect of GRI 417?
Sorry if I can interrupt. If someone doing the logistics can check the transmission of the visual, because we have no visual. Or I do. I don't anyway.
Thank you. And Pamela is nodding. She's doing that. Thank you. Okay. That being the case, I guess we have no sustained objection. Therefore, we have consensus. I'll move to ask Bastian, has due process in your view been met to date?
Due process has been met for this time.
Can I ask members present if... Chelsea, can you just run through the changes exactly?
Sure. So we would be looking to implement in GRI 417, marketing and labeling, the agreed upon overarching changes in the introduction section, including updating numbering of the standards, updated word edits, and the updated infographic. And we would also be removing the definition of non-compliant from the guidance section, and that is in lines 158 and 159, as well as lines 185 and 186 of the August 16th version of this standard.
Thank you. Where are we up to? Okay, can I ask those members of the GSSB in the room present to raise their hand if they agree to issuing this standard as discussed?
We have 10 votes in agreement in the room.
Thank you. Daniel Tayant, do you agree? Daniel Tayant?
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Daniel Ingram?
I do, yeah.
Thank you. Bastian, are there any significant changes between the exposure draft and the final approved GRI standard that require re-exposure?
No significant changes.
Okay. Can I ask members in the room present to raise their hand if they agree to issue this as a final without re-exposure?
We have 10 votes in agreement.
And Daniel Tayant, do you agree no re-exposure is necessary?
I agree.
And Daniel Ingram, do you agree?
I do, yeah.
Thank you. Again, we have another one down. Excellent.
Great.
Chelsea.
So it's actually going to turn over to Lara at this point to take you through the next 3 standards on the schedule.
Okay, and the next standard for discussion is GRI 205, anti-corruption. There's only one comment raised with regards to anti-corruption, but actually that comment was made in the context of GRI 120, or now 102, general disclosures, which we were scheduled to discuss before anti-corruption. But due to the latest changes to the agenda, I would like to explain the comment made in the context of general disclosures and then move on to discussing this in the context of anti-corruption. And we will pick up this comment again when we look at general disclosures this afternoon. So the comment made by a couple of GSSB members has to do with the examples of business partners that we have in the ethics and integrity section of general disclosures, and which also appears in the anti-corruption standard. The examples of business partners that are given are suppliers, agents, lobbyists, and other intermediaries, joint venture and consortia partners, governments, consumers, and clients. Two members raised that these examples overlap with our examples of stakeholder groups, and that in the context of ethics and integrity, when you look at clause 3.2.5, we have phrasing around business partners and other stakeholders. So actually all of these examples would actually be covered by other stakeholders as raised by the GSSB members. The proposal from those members who raised this issue was to either delete the paragraph or to review it now or in the future. The standards division would actually propose to remove this paragraph for the time being, both in the ethics and integrity section and in GRI 205 anti-corruption. This proposal is also based on one proposed change, which we will discuss later on in the context of management approach, where we are proposing to include business partners in the guidance of that standard, which means that since this term is likely to be used in multiple standards, the GSSB might consider to draft a definition of business partner in the future. Alternatively, if some GSSB members feel strongly to retain the examples, we would suggest to reword the paragraph to make it clear that this list of examples is only applicable in the context of that one standard and do not apply to the GRI standards as a whole. And here I'm going to quickly show you how this same paragraph is included in the anti-corruption standard. So same content, and this is placed in lines 146 till 148. So with that, over to you, Michael.
Is that the only issue you're going to raise on this standard?
Yes.
Okay.
Frankly, I don't have a problem with the definition of business partners in the original text. When we go through it point by point, these are business partners. And in the context of anti-corruption, I find it helpful to have it mentioned. I don't really see a reason why to remove it. I would keep the text as it is, the current wording.
Okay, thank you. Judy.
I also don't have a problem with the kind of the examples that are given here. They clearly are business partners. I think it's the first part of this term. In the context of the GRI standards, the term business partners used in this section includes, among others. It's quite definitive language in a way, and I sort of feel if we're going to be definitive, we should take it out of the standard and put it in the glossary as a definition, which means a bit more work for us. And under the circumstances, while I don't dispute any of these examples, I'm not sure how much they add to it in the context of the standard itself, and therefore I would probably go along with the Standards Division's proposal to delete it in the first instance, but open to further discussion on that.
Can I ask a couple of questions? One is, excuse me, personally, I wouldn't have thought customers were business partners in this context. But how does this relate to the discussion of impact, where we use the term business partners now as well, don't we? we use
You
that?
mean in topic boundary, where we use
Topic boundary, sorry, yes.
business
Topic boundary.
relationships?
Oh, business relationships,
Yes.
sorry. Okay, that's different. Okay, yeah, okay, so that, not so much a worry. But, so personally, I wouldn't have thought that customers were a business partner in this context. But if they are, and they are to be included for, the anti-corruption, then it's maybe worthwhile saying it. Personally, I wouldn't have thought of customers as business partners. I think business partners are people with whom you work to provide a service or a product to the customer. But that's me. So, well, okay, that's good. Kirsten.
I suppose the view on that would vary on what kind of business you are doing, but in my kind of industry, customers are definitely business partners.
Okay. Simeon?
Well, I think hearing the discussion now, I've got to understand why we want to include all those listed there as business partners. But the first time I read through it, I thought I had the feeling that business partners is really just in itself is very defined type of stakeholders, I just find that in line 291 to 93, when we say business partners and other stakeholders, has a bit of a conflict with the definition, because in line, if we say business partners and other stakeholders, it seems to distinguish business partners from the rest. But then the definition, we kind of inclusive of other stakeholders, and the list is kind of pretty comprehensive. Then when I read business partners and other stakeholders, I kind of wonder what other stakeholders would there be if you say business partner and other stakeholders, and that's why I raised this issue. Yeah, so just to explain the reason behind why I said that. Yeah.
Thank you. Daniel Tayant, you like to make a comment?
Yes, say that without the word as for example or may include, it's a very definitive definition of business partners. I mean, I don't have a problem with it, but it is rather exclusive, and I don't know to what extent we want to not. I mean, already we have some differences as to who we think business partners are. So unless we're unless we really want this definition to be solid, we either make it more flexible or eliminate it.
Chelsea.
Just a note to remind the GSSB of the previous discussion we had about this term. In G4, it was in the glossary as a definition, and it actually includes the same definition, but it also includes a mention to suppliers, and then it includes examples of what suppliers are based on our definition of suppliers. And the discussion the GSSB had previously, either in April or May, was to move this, because it wasn't considered a definition, it was just a list of examples, was to move it into guidance or introductory text in the standards where it relates to, which is why we now have it in the governance disclosures and in where ethics and integrity and in anti-corruption. So just a note in terms of thinking about moving it back into the glossary, we did have that discussion, and previously the GSSB thought it doesn't belong in the glossary in its current form.
Can I just ask you to move on to the next slide, just to refresh us on what the options are? David.
Yeah, I'm in favour of keeping these examples, because I think they're very important with regard to these particular standards, where these kinds of stakeholders, these kinds of people that have business relationships with an organisation, can be very important for things like ethics and integrity. And if we lose that, then companies can, maybe gaming is too strong, but they can decide who those business partners that they want to include in their reporting are. Whereas if we've mentioned the sort of organizations that we're talking about as business partners, then it's much more difficult for them to game it. And so I'm in favor of keeping this.
Oh, sorry, Kirsten.
Could we please go back to the other foil? I just saw one more thing. Whether they are available in different languages to reach all governance body members, workers performing, etc., etc. Does all then relate to all business partners and all other stakeholders, or does it all only relate to governance body members? That's, in best case, unclear, and if it relates to everything, I think it's a bit strict requirement. That in reality is way beyond reach.
So you're referring to line 309 there, the all. Okay, so this is the requirement, whether they are available, they being...
It's a reporting recommendation.
Recommendation, okay.
Yeah.
And what is they? What are they that are being made available?
Yes, all of that is a reporting recommendation.
Yes, and it's saying whether they are available in different languages. We're talking about codes of conduct. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
So this follows from a previous reporting recommendation. Yeah,
Right.
and this is G forwarding all governance body members, workers, etc. So it is not clear if all refers to all of those instances or just governance body members.
As long as it's recommendation, I'm comfortable about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so Simeon.
Does the word business partner has any conflict in definition with the financial world? I'm just well, if I say in the commercial sector, if I say this is my business partner, usually I would immediately think this is sort of a joint venture or somebody who has a financial stake in my business. If we say business partners includes all those, it's then a broader definition under the sustainability field. But would then, in terms of integrating reporting or in financial reporting, would that create any sort of problem? So I'm still looking at line 310 and 311 saying business partners and other stakeholders. Then shouldn't the definition be business partners in this section should include other stakeholders, including suppliers, agents, and all that kind of stuff, rather than to include that? I mean,
Say that last thing again, please. What?
I'm just basically saying if the term business partners in our context, when we come to a sort of more integrated reporting sense, would it conflict with the financial world's definition of business partners, which is more of like a financial involvement?
I mean,
others, yeah.
I'm not up to speed with accounting standards anymore per se, but related parties is usually the term they use, I think, rather than business partners.
Maybe just to add to the discussion. So the term business partners came into the mix in discussions with Transparency International and other single issue stakeholders in the field of anti-corruption. There it is a term that is quite established when you look at guidance provided by Transparency International, the UN Global Compact, what they have in terms of membership guidance around anti-corruption, but also the OECD M&E guidelines refer to business partners. And I think what we have is clearly also not, representing all the different definitions that probably exist for business partners, but it was at the time an inventory, I think, the attempt to signal to those that apply the guidelines what they should think of if for this particular subject matter. And I think it didn't, like the relationships with other standards were not considered. That is also just by design, the way we have dealt with issues in the past. And if we can contain as proposed for specific standards right now, the term that's my personal judgment, having been part of these earlier discussions, I think is right for that context. It is.
Judy?
I just wanted to, I've got the draft in front of me just to try to find what exactly is the context in which business partners is used in the proposed standard. And I don't know if I've got the same version because my line numbering isn't the same as what you have here. I mean, I might be looking at previous one. So please correct me if I'm not looking at the right thing here. We have two specific mentions that aren't in the kind of context setting, where reporters are asked to identify the total number of business partners that have received communications on anti-corruption, and indeed to estimate the total number of business partners. And then we've got a disclosure where they're asked total number of confirmed incidents where contracts with business partners were terminated or not renewed due to violations related to corruption. That last one actually suggests to me that we might need to really think about removing the definitive language, because I don't know if everybody who's listed in that definition of business partners is subject to contractual termination, possibility, for example. I mean, if there's a disclosure related to that, you would think that the definition of business partner would then align with people who could be subject to having contracts terminated. And I don't know if, anyway, I wanted to put it out there that we might need to look at this a bit more in the round rather than just the definition that's here.
Simeon.
Well, Julie, now that you've mentioned it, I did exactly the same check, and I now remember another reason I raised this was it's not. I don't think the reporting requirement is workable if we use that definition. So if we want to list the number of business partners, then if we include all those on the list, then it's not going to be very practical to do, and it's not going to be exhaustive. And a number like that, to me, doesn't really mean much.
Okay, I mean, I guess taking an alternate view on that is you can have a list as long as you like. If there's no contractual relationship with them, they just won't be included in this number. Yeah. So they just don't. They're business partners, but they don't fit into this part of the disclosure potentially. Bastian.
Maybe to just add to that, this goes back to an earlier discussion we had today. There was a particular framing for parts of the disclosures under the anti-corruption working group that formed part of G4 and also earlier processes, and that was that there is a legal context to some of these observations and contractual obligations or arrangements you have as one of the decisive factors to move this into observations that an organization can actually make. Because there's a gray zone when you talk about incidents and that there are no contracts and there are no mechanisms to bring that up. Part of the disclosures were framed like this. We've seen that earlier also in the discussion today. So it is indeed true, some of these disclosures just deal with a subset of the business partners, but that was by design. That was also acknowledged back then. It might very well be that this was also actually discussed in the run-up to the approval of the G4 contents.
Okay. Lara, can I ask you to go back to that slide that had your two alternatives on it? Okay, so your proposals are that we delete the examples of business partners from at least, well, from both places, yeah, where it appears, or if we want to keep it, that we amend it to make it explicit to those standards only. Is that basically what we're saying? Okay. Is there another alternative to these two that people would like us to consider, given the discussion we've had? Okay, so let's think about these two alternatives. One is to delete it altogether. The other is to keep it for the standards to which it applies and say we only use it for these standards for that purpose. Would anyone like to comment on either of those two alternatives to whether they favour one over the other? David?
Yeah, I'm not in favour of deleting, so I think the second bullet point is a reasonable compromise in this case.
Jürgen, you're nodding agreement. Yeah, Salima is nodding. That makes sense to me as well, given the nervousness about deleting it and things. Okay, so if we were to put that as the proposal, would anyone object to that? Either Daniels?
What is the second bullet point?
Okay, so what we're suggesting is we retain the examples, but the Standards Division amends the text to ensure that the term is interpreted, the term business partner only applies to the sections where it relates to a recommendation or a requirement. And it'd be saying that in the context of this GRI standard, the term business partners used in this section includes blah, 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 that list. Does that make sense to you, Daniel?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, it does make sense.
Okay.
The only question I would have, and it's not a concern, is simply, does it mean something else in different sections? And if not, what's the need for specifying the section? But I would not have a problem with that text if that was the approved text.
Okay, is it used in other sections, Lara?
We're currently proposing to add business partners in the topic boundary guidance, which we will discuss in the context of management approach. But the proposal would be not to include these examples in the topic boundary guidance, so just have the term with no definition or list of examples.
Bastian, did you want to comment?
No, it is this point. So I think we can say for what we're trying to contain here is that it was introduced in a particular context, and we're just making sure that it is also only used in this context now. And I would, the point that Laura was just making, we can come back to that later because that's still up for decision, and then we can look at that separately. I wouldn't make this judgment now dependent on whether or not we include it with the topic boundary issue under the management approach.
Okay, so I mean, it does seem to be that if we follow the principle of not disturbing G4 to the unnecessarily, that it might be best to follow this advice and to keep but limit it to where we intended that specific meaning. So, are people happy with that? Simeon?
I still have a question surrounding in this section. What does that mean? In this section or in this standard?
Yeah, so in general disclosures, we say in this section because there's 5 sections of general disclosures, and these examples only apply in the ethics and integrity section. So we're trying to be very explicit that it's only for the ethics and integrity context that we are using these examples. So if in the future we want to add a reference to business partners, let's say in governance, then these examples wouldn't apply to that section. Again, this would be up for decision in the future by the GSSB.
Are there any other comments on this? Simeon?
Actually, in that case, I would actually prefer leaving it as it is because it's kind of confusing by saying, okay, this is the definition, it applies here, it doesn't apply there, and as a reporter, it's just difficult to follow. Yeah, I think.
Chelsea?
Given that we don't have it in other sections of the general disclosures now, and that if we were to update other sections, we would have to be doing a review of the whole standard, it's also possible for us just to say, in the context of this GRI standard, the term business partners includes, amongst others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a good point that we're making, trying to be specific, but it's not yet applicable, and we would have the opportunity to revise that in the future.
Okay, being no more comments, I think that is what we're agreeing. Is that correct? Anyone disagree with that? That we're going to limit it to the 2 standards where it applies? Okay, thank you. Lara? Okay.
No other issues raised with anti-corruption, so we can move on to approval.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So we're going to go. So, is there any, given the discussion, is there any sustained objection? Anyone who would care to block consensus on this? That being the case, Bastian, can I ask whether due process has been met to date?
Due process be met for the standard.
Thank you. Laura, can I ask you just to give us a rendition of what it is that we will be voting on?
So the agreed upon changes for GRI 205 anti-corruption are the wording changes we have agreed to this morning to the introduction section and the renumbering of the universal standards, to revise the text in lines 146 to 148 to make it clear that this definition relates to this standard specifically. So that sentence would now read, in the context of this GRI standard, the term business partners includes, among others, and then the list of examples included in the 16th of August draft.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're going to ask people to vote on this standard, which is GRI 205, anti-corruption, with the changes noted up there. Can I ask all those in the room who agree to this standard being issued to raise their hand?
We have 11 votes in agreement.
And Daniel Tayant, do you agree that this standard to approve?
I agree.
Daniel Ingram, do you agree?
I do agree, yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Bastian, is there any reason that we should re-expose this?
There are no significant changes that would warrant re-exposure.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask the people in the room if you agree that we do not need to re-expose this to raise your hand?
And we have 11 votes in agreement.
And Daniel Tayant, do you agree no re-exposure is necessary?
I agree.
And Daniel Ingram, do you agree?
I do agree, yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, excellent. Next one down. I'll just, for the record, mention, Robin, I mentioned that you were out when we approved a couple of earlier standards, but we had a quorum and we had the right number. And I imagine that if you did have an issue, you would have flagged it with those particular standards. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you. We won't adjust the vote, but just to clear. Laura or Chelsea? Laura.
The next standard is GRI 408, child labor. And here there's two set of changes that we would like to discuss with you now. One set of changes has to do with the background section for disclosure 408.1. For this, we have circulated this morning, it should be in front of you, an extract of the standard where we have implemented all of the changes proposed by GSSB members in track changes. So if you can grab that, I will walk you through the changes in a moment. So during the GSSB review of this standard on Annotate, there were a few suggestions to shorten this section from lines 20 to 45. So on the back of your handout. So the standards division had proposed to delete certain paragraphs. Following that, a couple of GSSB members suggested bringing those paragraphs back in because they are helpful for understanding the issue at hand, which is child labor. So you see those paragraphs in line 32 to 36 and from 38 to 42. So that's one change. Then in that same review on Annotate, one of the GSSB members, Dwight Justice, included a clarification on the difference between child labor and children working or young persons working. Following that, another GSSB member flagged that this clarification is actually very helpful for understanding this difference and how to apply the disclosure. So we have brought this clarification into lines 24 to 25, which says that child labor refers to an abuse, which is not to be confused with children working or with young persons working, which may not be abuses as stipulated in ILO Convention 138. And in addition, we have slightly rearranged the order of the paragraphs to accommodate these changes.
Is this the only change for this standard?
No, there's another set of changes.
Okay. Is it, it's not related per se, it's different?
It's not related to this section,
Okay.
but to the
All right.
background context.
Okay, all right, so let's discuss this. Sorry, can I ask Daniel, do Daniel Tayant and Daniel Ingram have a copy of this handout? Pamela? Okay, all right. So, I mean, you're going a little bit sight unseen. Hopefully, Lara's explanation makes it clear what we're talking about, but hopefully we'll get you the specific words. The two paragraphs or large, is it worth reading those out, those two large inclusions?
I can do that. And just to clarify, this is what we had in the exposure draft of
thank
child labor. So basically, these changes are reverting to what we had for public exposure.
Okay.
So the two paragraphs, the one starting on line 32 is ILO Convention 138 stipulates that national laws or regulations may permit the employment or work of persons 13 to 15 years of age on light work which is A, not likely to be harmful to their health or development, and B, not such as to prejudice their attendance at school, their participation in vocational orientation or training programs approved by the competent authority, or their capacity to benefit from the instruction received. The next paragraph, starting in line 38, says ILO Convention 182 is intended to set priorities for states. However, organizations are expected not to use this convention to justify forms of child labor. This includes all forms of slavery or practices similar to slavery, such as sale, trafficking, forced or compulsory labor, serfdom, recruitment for armed conflict, the use, procuring, or offering of a child for prostitution or illicit activities, and any work that is likely to harm the health, safety, or morals of children.
Okay, thank you for that. Would anyone care to comment on this? Kirsten?
I suppose this is directly quotes from ILO 182. Yeah, in such case I
Yes,
have
correct.
no further suggestions. I don't think it's completely clear, the text, but we cannot change that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think these are reasonably helpful. And they're going back to the exposure draft. Yeah, okay. So people around here are nodding for those on the phone. I think there's people who are happy with this. Daniel Ingram or Daniel Tayant, please speak up if you're unhappy or unclear. Okay. Shall I ask Lara, please, to go on to the next issue?
The GSSB also fine with the clarification around child labor and children working?
Yes,
Yeah?
I think that was the package, yep.
Yeah, okay,
Yep.
great. So the next comment raised by GSSB members has to do with wording around due diligence. So in the previous iteration of this draft, we had sentence in a background context which says that an organization is expected to act with due diligence in order to prevent the use of child labor within its activities. Following GSSB feedback during the annotated review, this was changed to conduct due diligence, which is in line with wording used in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines. Ahead of this meeting, there was a concern raised with this change, and one GSSB member suggests to revert back to say, act with due diligence. Our proposal would be to remain with the term conduct, which is consistent with the two key authoritative instruments for this topic, which are the OECD guidelines and the guiding principles.
And sorry, can I just clarify what was exposed?
I believe it's act with due diligence, but I would need to check.
Okay, all right. So you're suggesting we go with the ILO? Yeah, okay.
The OECD guidelines
OECD,
and the
sorry, yeah.
UN guiding principle.
Okay. Salima?
Well, this is the thing about a concept. due diligence is a concept. It's a broadly known and developed by, I think, over the past 10 years by specialists. And due diligence is a process. So for me, it's very odd to read that a company should conduct due diligence because we're not talking about conduct audits. We are talking about what is being backgrounded by the whole discussion around business and human rights. An organization should act diligently to identify, to assess, to manage, to prevent risks and impacts and violations to human rights. So when talking about due diligence, we are talking about a very complex process and not about to apply some mechanism to audit activities or services or goods in terms of preventing violations to human rights. So my point here is, and I just checked within several diverse documents that are the main frameworks regarding human rights, and it makes sense an organization is expected to act diligently, as in act with the diligence to prevent violations to human rights. And to act with the diligence comprises even to communicate to others. There's some violations on human rights are being perpetrated by organization activities. So to conduct the diligence does not comprise prioritization of activities to prevent risks to human rights. To conduct audit does not comprise the communication to other stakeholders about impacts on human rights. So that's why I'm fighting against this change. And as far as remember, it was exposed to the public, the first version of this sentence. So that's what I have to say right now.
All right, thank you. And Chelsea's just confirmed that act with is what was exposed. Kirsten. Oh, okay. Yeah, Lara, please.
So GSSB member Dwight Justice sent his view on this issue ahead of the meeting, and since he's not here, may I quote him directly?
Please do.
So he said, the underlying issue is, does the GRI want to be part of the international consensus over business behavior or not? The meaning of due diligence in these two instruments, the OECD guidelines and the guiding principles, is different from other forms of due diligence that can be required of enterprises. This other due diligence is sometimes distinguished by the term transactional due diligence. A definition of due diligence taken from the guiding principles should be in the glossary, if it is not already. It is in there. And then he adds that reporting should be about processes which can be conducted, and to act with due diligence is too ad hoc. My strongly held view is to stick with conduct.
Sorry, hold on. Nankuma.
I was just thinking loud, can we have both? Conduct and act with.
Okay, noted. Salima.
Because I know what is background in Dwight thinking, so I was triple checking the UNGP guidance on human rights, business and human rights, and at page 16, item B, it says a human rights due diligence process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their impacts on human rights. So basically, Dwight and myself, we're telling the same thing about due diligence being a process. As a practitioner, for me, it's very odd to use the verb conduct, because then we are leading due diligence to a transactional agreement, for instance. Because in the business arena, sometimes due diligence, it's a synonym for audit. And in terms of human rights, it's not. It's way more than just to establish an audit program in order to identify impacts. The diligence is a process. So in terms of the concept, Dwight and myself, we are telling the same thing, but I'm not in agreement to use this verb, conduct due diligence, but act diligently to prevent violations. So we can either revert back to act with due diligence, or to change for act diligently. And I've previously to this meeting, I've consulted language professor in order to be sure that I'm not making any language mistakes. And this person told to me it's completely different to conduct something in terms of establishing a program to conduct an audit or something like that. Is completely different from act diligently in terms of preventing violations.
Okay. I mean, I am a little confused, because if it's a process, you don't act with a process. You conduct a process. So I'm a bit confused. But Simeon, did you? Oh, sorry, you've taken yours down. Yeah. No.
Yeah, I had the same confusion, but looking at this from a non-expert on this sort of I'm familiar with environmental due diligence, but not human rights due diligence. But I thought the whole issue would involve the organization identifying the issues or potential issues, then acting to mitigate it, which is a universal requirement for everything, human rights, environmental, whatever issues it is. So to me, just looking at it from an English point of view, just to conduct a due diligence means I just conduct an assessment and identify the issues, and I stop there. So act with, listening to what Sulema said, would be inclusive of conducting, so identifying the issues and then acting upon it. So I think act with is actually more inclusive of the whole process. But if it's still unclear, then the Kuma's suggestion would be quite good. You conduct the assessment and then you act with it. So it's conduct and act with due diligence. That will cover all the issues that we're worried about. Yeah.
Chelsea.
So I will start by saying this is not my area of expertise, but I am good at reading documents sometimes. And one of the, referring back to the UN guiding principles, where this is actually used in the, what I believe to be the main requirement paragraph here, which is human rights due diligence, the actual language that's used in the requirement paragraph is to carry out human rights due diligence. And I wonder if that might be a middle ground that would be more representative of a process, an ongoing process, but more perhaps grammatically correct than to say act with a process. So the sentence is, in order to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their adverse human rights impacts, business enterprises should carry out human rights due diligence. Throughout the document, we have noted a variety of different interpretations in other sentences related to due diligence, including conduct, including require, and other formulations. But I think that I would put that on the table as a possible compromise.
Yeah, just on that point of due diligence, I mean, I've noticed it in a number of places where the word or the term due diligence is used. And due diligence, in my view, because I'm accounting background, is a transactional approach to an acquisition. So it's used shorthand for all of that. But in this context, it's used as shorthand for what you know it to be. And in other places, in the judgment of law, it just means act diligently. It doesn't have specifics that attach to it. It's contextual. So I am a bit concerned about it. I hear what Chelsea says about carry out. Just check Sulema. Does that do an exercise is another exercise due diligence? Or just put another one on the table. Due diligence is expected of an organisation in order to prevent the use of child labour. Right, and then you avoid the verb. Okay. Daniel Tayant.
Yes, I do agree with the last comments on perhaps using the UN guiding principles language. As a human rights activist, words are very important, and in my take on this, acting diligently is very different from conducting due diligence. Due diligence is a process, it's recognized. Acting diligently is a nice adjective, or adverb in this case, but it doesn't refer to a process that is established and is expected. And so I would be careful to go with something less prescriptive than either conducting due diligence or really, I think we need to stick to that sense of a process. Getting away from that is a danger, in my view.
Thank you, Daniel. Salima.
The other source of my concern is about translation, and it's about how organizations are coping with human rights. So, from my experience, the organizations are taking out from the transactional activities the due diligence in order to establish audit programs. It's quite different from acting in terms of efficiency and to establish remediation plans when some violations are identified. It's completely different. It's a way more complex process that requires even stakeholder engagement and consultation when establishing remediation plans and implementing remediation plans. So the human rights due diligence does comprise more than audit programs. But in fact, because it's very hard to organizations to cope with this complex process, some global organizations are coping with human rights by establishing due diligence programs without the 5 or 7 steps that are being predicted by the international frameworks. This is my concern. It's not only about not using the correct verb, in my opinion. It's about to establish a guidance to organizations to better understand their impacts and to better manage risks and impacts. This is one thing. And the other thing is about translation. If we use the correct words, we can translate in a very precise way the idea of the complex process that comprises the human rights due diligence. This is my concern. That's why I do like the act diligently, because in Portuguese it makes more sense than conducted due diligence. Because in my experience in Brazil, the Brazilian companies will start to say, well, I do have an audit program that investigate some non-compliance within my supply chain. And this is not human rights due diligence at all, because the human rights due diligence also comprises guidance, policies, that it applies to every single activity of an organization. So this is my concern of not having the right word to convey what we want to convey here.
Okay, that's quite broad-reaching, because if taking that to its extreme, neither of these solutions would necessarily cover what you want, potentially. Is that right? I mean, acting diligently would miss out on what I thought Daniel Tayant was saying, in that due diligence is a defined thing in the sphere. If we just say act diligently, people can step around an established process of due diligence. But if we say due diligence, you're saying people will step around it, they'll confine it to that process, and they won't do the other things that are expected. So it's a bit of a no-win. I can't, sorry, but... Okay, Nankuma.
I agree with Suleiman, but if we do carry out or conduct a due diligence, but if we do not act on it, then it just remains on the paper as a report. Mm-hmm. And knowing that, yes, we have risk in the supply chain, or we have risk within our own organization, but then the stakeholder is more interested in knowing what did we do to mitigate the risk, mm-hmm, or bring down the impact.
Okay, Chelsea's just made the point that it's background guidance, so that's an interesting contextual thing. What about that suggestion I made of due diligence is expected of organisations in order to prevent the use of child labour within its activities? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, all right. And I can see Dwight nodding. No, I can't. He's not here. But hopefully Daniel Talent, who's spoken to the issue, and Daniel Ingram, if you have any problem with that, you would raise it now. Okay, well, let's go with that. So that rewording. Were there other issues in this one?
No other issues.
Okay. Okay, so we're moving to approval. So what's the number? Just standard. Yeah.
Just 1 second. It's 409.
409.
Sorry, it's 408.
Okay. Did you want to mention something? Okay, so we're just getting the slides in order at the moment. So we're looking at GRI standard 409.
408, so.
408, okay. And can I ask whether anyone in the room or on the phone has any sustained objection that would block consensus? No? Pending, Bastian, has due process been met in your opinion to date?
Due process has been met for this standard.
Okay. I'm going to ask for a vote and then we're going to go through the specifics of what we actually voted on, but it's a mere expedience. I don't think it matters in substance. Could I ask people to vote, pending the clarification exactly of what it is we're voting on, to approve this standard? Please raise your hand in the room. Those who agree.
We have 11 votes in agreement.
And Daniel Tarrant, do you agree?
I agree.
Daniel Ingram, do you agree?
I do.
Thank you. And can I ask Laura just to go through exactly the wording that we're saying?
So as with the other topic standards, we have agreed to implement the changes to the introduction section discussed earlier today. Then we have agreed to bring back 2 paragraphs into the guidance section of disclosure 4081. These 2 paragraphs relate to ILO Convention 138 and ILO Convention 182, and to also bring in 1 clarification sentence on the difference between child labor and children working or young persons working. Then in the background context section, we have just agreed to amend the sentence which refers to due diligence to say due diligence is expected of an organization in order to prevent child labor, etc.
Excellent. Okay, that accords with what everyone thinks that they were voting on. We can confirm that. Okay. Bastian, is there any reason that we should re-expose this in your view?
No reason for re-exposure.
Okay. Can I ask those in the room who agree that re-exposure is not necessary to raise their hand?
We have 11 votes in agreement.
Daniel Tarrant, do you agree re-exposure is not necessary?
I agree.
And Daniel Ingram, do you agree?
I agree.
Thank you. Excellent. And onward and upward. We're on to which standard next?
409, forced or compulsory labor.
Okay.
For this standard, there's only 1 issue raised ahead of the meeting, which we have just discussed. Is the same sentence on conducting due diligence. So over to you, Michael. I'm guessing we will be making changes consistent with child labor.
Okay. And that's the only change?
The only issue raised ahead of the meeting, yeah.
Okay, it's the due diligence sentence. Okay. I also assume that people, if they were comfortable with it then, will be comfortable with it here. So no sustained objections. Bastian, is due process being met with respect to 409?
Yes, due process has been met for 409.
Can I ask Laura to just read out what it is that we're voting on?
So we're voting on making the changes agreed upon this morning to the introduction section, updating infographic, updating numbering of universal standards, etc. And also we will update the 1 sentence in the background context section, which refers to conducting due diligence. We will amend that to say due diligence is expected of an organization in order to prevent forced or compulsory labor, etc.
Very good. Okay. Can I ask everyone in the room, or members in the room, if they agree that this 409 should be issued as a final standard, to raise their hand?
We have 10 votes in agreement.
I just note that Nankuma has left for a moment, but before leaving he expressed that he indicated that he had no objection. And can I ask Daniel Tarrant, do you have any, do you agree?
I agree.
And Daniel Ingram, do you agree?
Yes.
Thank you. Bastian, is there any reason significant changes that we should re-expose?
No reason for re-exposure, no significant changes.
Thank you. Can I ask those in the room who agree that we don't need to re-expose to raise a hand?
And we have 10 votes in agreement.
Okay. Daniel Tarrant, do you agree that we don't need to re-expose?
I agree.
And Daniel Ingram, do you agree?
I do.
Thank you. Okay, so it's another one down. How many do we have in this batch? That's it. Okay. So, yeah, we're just about, so we've got 10 minutes before lunch. We could break now. Is anyone, Jürgen?
Can I please use this opportunity to make a little personal comment? This discussion we had right now about due diligence reminds me of other situations we had earlier and we will have in future also. In this room, some of us are native speakers, others are not. And that is unavoidable. Otherwise, it would have been a precondition for being a member of this board to be only, one coming from one of the 5 English-speaking countries, right? Which is certainly not the case. So I'm not here, me personally, and maybe some others, to judge very slight little differences in English. Although we work in English, and this is an English text, and we go into the very nitty-gritty about details and the comma here and slight differences. I personally can judge, can use, and can implement the slightest differences in my own language, in style, in correctness, in even using my language differently in different centuries. I can do that. But the other languages I use are working tools. So that leads me to the conclusion, and also in the past it led me to the conclusion, that I leave certain decisions to those who are better than I in using English. And I admit I'm not perfect. I cannot enter certain discussions when it's about a slight difference in this and this and that. So I do think we have to live with that, and admitting that I'm not perfect in English in comparison to the native speakers still gives me the right to vote on this or that version. So we have to be aware of these differences. And sometimes I feel certain discussions should not go too deep into some differences. I am very happy to leave final decisions and final conclusions to those who are native speakers and are very experienced in the subject we deal with. I admit that I'm imperfect with that respect, but I'm not here for that. So that's just a little personal comment, if you allow me.
Very much. Kirsten?
I agree to a large extent to what you are saying, Jürgen. Still, I do believe that we that do not have English as our first language have an important role in commenting to what will work also for those users of GRI that don't have English as their first language, which means we need a simple language that can be translated and that can be made possible to understand for us who needs to use the framework, the standards in the English language.
Only one sentence. I agree with you. And I took the liberty...
2 sentences. Oh, no, it's one end. Okay. Just a point of grammar, sorry.
I say that as a non-native. No, and I took the liberty in the past to put my opinion on certain subjects. For instance, I commented several times, compensation is not the right term. I do believe people are not compensated for something. Remuneration is a better term. But I allow any native speaker to say, look, you are not very correct in this because in my language, and there might be a difference in the UK and the US and in Australia or New Zealand or wherever, how a certain term is used. And we have to agree here with what kind of version of English we are using in these texts.
Okay, thank you. Judy?
Just to say that I think this conversation applies equally well to lots of content areas within the GRI standards. I won't personally claim to be a great expert on some fine detail of greenhouse gas emissions reporting or something like that. And I need to be able to rely on the wisdom of working groups and on my colleagues as well. But I think this is a good kind of reminder of exactly how our role works on the GSSB, that we aren't here individually to each sign off to the same level, because we all have different areas of expertise and experience and so forth, and we need to be able to sort of stand behind our decisions collectively, with the confidence that among us and among any working groups that we've convened to do any of this work, we have covered the bases as far as any kind of technical content as well as precision of language.
Thanks, Judy. Salima.
Just one last comment. I do support I do support all my colleagues that just said things about language and being or not being native speakers. But I have to raise one point about the due diligence discussion. This is not only about language, it's an international discussion. And I've been part of technical groups that are studying, researching how to better establish a good worldwide recognized definition of human rights due diligence. So it's not only about human rights due diligence. The discussion is not only about language, the use of words, it's about the process and what this process would comprise. This is my only comment. Thank you.
Thank you. I think all that discussion was very helpful. So, we're not all native English speakers. We should therefore keep the language as simple as possible, as universal as possible. We're not all experts in various fields. We have to rely on each other to come to a reasonable conclusion. We should follow precedents and international conventions to the absolute extent we can. And I think you're right. They're all salient points, and that we all need to carry out, conduct, act with, and exercise due diligence. I think, don't you? It's expected that we all carry out, conduct, exercise. Okay, thank you. That really was actually very helpful. Thank you, Jürgen, for raising it. So that brings us to lunchtime, almost exactly. I'm looking for the timetable so we know what time to come back. Okay, it's now 12:30 or 12:28, and we'll be back in 1 hour. We're starting at 1:30 Amsterdam time. Thank you, everyone.